The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon when Jason Montgomery received the phone call that would shatter the quiet life he had spent years building. He had just finished his shift at the local hardware store, a place where he'd worked for the past decade, far removed from the towering skyscrapers and high-stakes meetings that had been part of his father's world. His father, Marcus Montgomery, a name that had echoed through the halls of luxury and business for decades, was now in a coma, his life hanging by a thread. The call was from a lawyer, an attorney who had never even bothered to make an appearance at the family gatherings, and certainly not someone Jason had ever spoken to. The words were blunt. "Mr. Montgomery is in critical condition. We need you to come immediately. You're his next of kin." Jason felt his heart race as the world seemed to stand still. He hadn't spoken to his father in years, and the last time they'd seen each other, it had been a cold, tense exchange at the family estate. After his mother's passing, his father had become a stranger, consumed by work, consumed by his empire, and Jason had been left to fend for himself. He had never felt the weight of his father's legacy, never felt the need to. But now, with those simple words from the lawyer, he was thrust back into a world he had carefully avoided. He wasn't even sure why he was still listed as his father's next of kin, given the bitter estrangement that had grown over the years. It was a small town, and news like this spread quickly. By the time Jason arrived at the hospital, whispers had already begun to circulate, the gossip mill churning over the fate of the multimillionaire and what this meant for his vast business empire. Jason parked his car in the lot, its modest condition a stark contrast to the sleek, black limousines that lined the hospital entrance, transporting people who seemed to think that money could solve anything. Jason walked in, feeling small, invisible among the polished crowd. The nurses and staff barely glanced at him as he approached the emergency room, as if they could already tell that he didn't belong there. But there was something else, too. A sense of anticipation hung in the air, like everyone was waiting for something dramatic to unfold. Perhaps they were waiting for Marcus Montgomery to wake up, for him to pull through and take control of his empire once again. Or perhaps they were waiting for something far worse, to hear that the man who had ruled so many lives, both directly and indirectly, had finally met his end. The room was sterile, silent, and cold, save for the faint beeping of the machines keeping Marcus alive. Jason stood there for a moment, staring at the unconscious man who had once been larger than life in his eyes. Marcus Montgomery, the self-made billionaire, the man whose name had adorned countless headlines, whose business moves had shaped entire industries, was now a mere shell of his former self. He looked frail, vulnerable, something Jason had never associated with his father. For all his flaws, his coldness, and his distant love, Marcus had always been a towering figure, both in stature and influence. And now, that towering figure was reduced to a bedridden patient, incapable of making his own decisions. The weight of the moment hit Jason hard, but there was no time for sentimental reflections. He knew the moment he stepped into that room that his life would never be the same again. A nurse stepped forward, her face a mask of professionalism. "You must be Mr. Montgomery's son. We've been expecting you," she said softly, her voice almost too gentle, as if treading lightly around some unspoken truth. "The doctors are doing everything they can, but the situation is grave." Jason nodded numbly, feeling his throat tighten. He had no idea what to say. What could he say? The last time he had seen his father was during a bitter argument when Jason had left home at 18, vowing never to return. Marcus hadn't tried to reach out, and Jason hadn't cared. That was the story of their relationship, one of silence, resentment, and unspoken words. But now, standing in front of the man who had been both a distant father and a powerful, ruthless figure in the world, Jason couldn't help but feel something stir within him. Regret, maybe, or something more complicated. The nurse gave him a brief rundown of his father's condition and left him alone to process the overwhelming flood of emotions that hit him like a wave. Jason sank into the chair next to his father's bed, the beeping of the machine steady but distant. His mind raced with questions. How had this happened? Why hadn't anyone contacted him sooner? But most pressing of all, what now? What was he supposed to do? The phone rang again, this time with another shocking revelation. The lawyer on the other end informed Jason that there was something else he needed to know, a piece of news that would change everything. Marcus's will had been updated recently, and it contained a clause that, in the event of a coma, would trigger a series of legal actions regarding his business interests. Jason's mind reeled. He had always assumed that Marcus had left everything to him, his only son. But now, the lawyer's words echoed in his head. There's a stipulation. It's not what you think. Jason's stomach dropped as the lawyer explained that Marcus's most trusted associates were now waiting for him to make decisions regarding the future of the family business. But with one caveat, the clause in the will designated Marcus's ex-wife, Linda, as the sole inheritor of his fortune, a woman Jason had never known, and one whom he had been told to forget long ago. Suddenly, Jason was no longer just the son of a man in a coma. He was a man facing a moral dilemma. Linda, who had not been part of his life in any significant way, was now a central figure in his family's future. The thought of her, someone he knew only through distant, resentful conversations with his father, inheriting everything, was hard to swallow. Yet it was his responsibility to honor his father's wishes, or was it? He had spent so many years trying to forget Marcus, but now he had to confront the reality of being his father's voice. And that voice had to make a decision, one that would determine not only his own future, but the future of an entire community that depended on the Montgomery Empire. Jason felt the weight of the world on his shoulders as he stared at the lifeless figure in the bed, knowing that this was only the beginning of what would become the most shocking chapter of his life. Jason sat in the sterile hospital room, the weight of his father's unexpected coma pressing down on him. He was surrounded by people he didn't know, yet who all seemed to think they had some right to be there. The doctors, the staff, the lawyers, even the distant relatives. Each one had their own agenda. It was as if Marcus Montgomery, the titan of business, had suddenly become a pawn in a game none of them had ever let him play. Jason's mind raced. What was he supposed to do? He hadn't even been a part of his father's life for so long, and now, here he was, thrust into the center of it all. He looked at the lifeless figure in the bed, a man who had once been a towering presence in the business world. The contrast between the man Marcus had been and the broken body in front of him was almost too much to bear. The first couple of days were a blur. Jason spent them in the hospital, constantly fielding calls from Marcus's associates, most of whom he'd never met. They all expected him to take charge, to step into his father's shoes, as if he had been prepared for this moment his entire life. But Jason knew nothing about the business world his father had ruled with an iron fist. He had never been groomed for leadership, never given a chance to learn the ropes. All he had known was a life of neglect, a feeling like an outsider in his own family. Now he was expected to make decisions that would affect hundreds, maybe thousands, of people. And what was worse, he didn't even know if he could trust anyone around him. It was Linda, his father's ex-wife, who was the first to approach him about the will. Her presence was almost as unexpected as the clause that would see her inherit everything. Jason had heard about Linda over the years, his father's bitter ex-wife, the woman who had apparently been a part of his life before the wealth, before the empire, before the fame. But in all those years, he had never seen her face, never heard her side of the story. From what Marcus had said, she was nothing more than a gold digger who had taken everything he had. Jason had always assumed she had been a mere obstacle in his father's path to success, a chapter he had closed long ago. But now, Linda was back, and she was as much a part of this mess as anyone. When Jason first met her in the hospital lobby, he barely recognized her. She was older, of course, but there was a sharpness in her eyes, a look that told him she was no stranger to the game his father had played. She didn't seem at all like the woman he had imagined, weak, vulnerable, or desperate. Instead, she was confident, composed, and had a determination in her that mirrored his father's own. "I didn't want this, Jason," she said quietly, her voice steady. "But your father made it clear. This business is mine now." Jason stood frozen, unsure how to respond. He had been prepared for any number of scenarios, but this felt like a betrayal, not just of him, but of his entire sense of self. All these years, he had believed that Marcus had abandoned him, that he had been the forgotten son. But now, this woman, this stranger, was stepping into his father's life as though it was her birthright. "You didn't deserve this," Jason finally said, his voice tinged with frustration. "You don't know anything about my father's life, about what he's done, about the mistakes he's made." Linda didn't flinch. "I may not have lived in your father's world, but I knew him better than anyone. And the truth is, Jason, your father was a lot more complicated than you give him credit for. You have no idea what he went through to build this empire. I didn't come here to take revenge or anything else. I came because I'm in charge now, and if you want to be a part of it, you're going to have to make some difficult choices." Jason's chest tightened. It felt like the world was closing in on him. He hadn't asked for any of this. He had worked hard to leave all of it behind, to find his own path away from the world that had always overshadowed him. And now fate had dragged him back into it, just as the darkness of his father's past was rising to the surface. The more Jason spent time in the hospital, the more he uncovered about Marcus's life, about the shady deals, the ruthless business tactics, the people his father had crushed along the way to the top. It was hard to reconcile the man in the bed with the legacy he had left behind. Jason had always believed that his father's wealth was the result of hard work and vision. But the deeper he dug, the more he realized that the empire Marcus had built was built on deceit, manipulation, and compromise. One day, while Jason was going through his father's office, he stumbled upon a box of old documents, contracts, letters, and personal notes, some of which were written in his father's own hand. The most startling of all was a letter addressed to Linda, written just before their divorce. In it, Marcus confessed to having made decisions that he regretted, decisions that had destroyed their family. He admitted to using people, to manipulating them for his own gain, and to abandoning his son in the process. Jason read the letter over and over, unable to tear his eyes away from the rawness of it. His father had never apologized for anything, not to him, not to anyone. And yet, here was the proof that Marcus had known what he had done, that he had seen the damage he had caused. The revelation hit Jason hard. He was angry, but there was something else too, a deep sadness that he had spent so many years blaming his father for everything. He had built an entire narrative around his father's negligence and his own resentment, but the truth was more complicated than he had ever imagined. Marcus hadn't been a perfect man, far from it, but he had been human. And the more Jason thought about it, the more he realized that he had been given a rare opportunity, not just to inherit his father's wealth, but to rewrite the future, to make a choice that could change everything. But could he do it? Could he take on the responsibility that his father had refused to? The thought of managing the business, of continuing the empire, felt like an impossible task. He had no experience, no guidance, and no real desire to follow in his father's footsteps. But as the days went on, Jason began to understand that this wasn't about his father anymore. It was about him. It was about his ability to change, to confront the demons of his past, and to decide who he wanted to be in the future. Linda's words echoed in his mind. If you want to be a part of it, you're going to have to make some difficult choices. But Jason wasn't sure he was ready to make those choices. All he knew for certain was that the world he thought he had left behind was pulling him back in, and there was no turning away from it now. Jason spent the next few days in a state of restless agitation, torn between the overwhelming weight of responsibility and the nagging pull of resentment he had carried for so long. He spent most of his time at the hospital, unable to tear himself away from his father's bedside. But his mind kept drifting back to the letter he had found in his father's office, the confession that had shaken him to his core. It was a letter that painted Marcus Montgomery in a new light, one that was harder to ignore than the towering figure he had always known. In the quiet moments when the hospital room was still, Jason's thoughts spiraled back to the hard, cold truths he had uncovered. For years, he had believed his father's empire was built purely on brilliance, ruthlessness, and the strategic placement of wealth. But now, with the letter as proof, Jason had to confront the undeniable fact that Marcus had built it on something far darker: betrayal, manipulation, and an unrelenting ambition that had cost more than he was willing to admit. The guilt and shame in those handwritten words haunted Jason, but the truth was clear. His father's rise to the top had come at the expense of those closest to him. His marriage to Linda had been destroyed because of his infidelities. His strained relationship with Jason had been the result of years of neglect, and the very business he had founded had left a trail of broken promises and shattered lives. It was all too much to bear. Jason had always thought of himself as a product of that empire, a son left in the shadows, neglected and forgotten. He had spent years working in the quiet obscurity of a simple job, hoping to forget the glittering world his father had controlled. But now, that very world was at his doorstep, demanding his attention, his decisions, and his soul. The weight of it was suffocating. One night, unable to sleep, Jason wandered the halls of the hospital. The silence was broken only by the low hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional shuffle of staff moving from one room to another. As he walked aimlessly, trying to clear his mind, he found himself standing in front of the hospital's chapel. The door was slightly ajar, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he stepped inside. The chapel was small, dimly lit, with rows of wooden pews facing a simple altar. The stillness of the space seemed to resonate with the turmoil he felt inside. He sank into a pew, the hard wood pressing against his back, and closed his eyes, willing himself to think clearly. His thoughts circled back to his father's legacy, to the business, to Linda, to everything that was at stake. In that quiet, sacred space, he began to ask himself questions that had never occurred to him before. What did he really want? What kind of person was he becoming? Could he keep walking down the path that had been set for him? Or was this his chance to break free, to forge his own identity, to decide for once what he was capable of? It was then that the unexpected happened. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. The caller ID read Linda Montgomery. He had expected her to call, but he hadn't anticipated it to be this soon. With a deep breath, he answered the call. "Jason." Linda's voice came through the phone, steady but sharp. "I know this is difficult, but we need to talk about what happens next. Your father's condition isn't improving, and the longer we wait, the more uncertain everything becomes. The legal team is pressing for answers. I know you're not prepared for this, but the clock is ticking." Jason's grip tightened on the phone. The urgency in her voice wasn't lost on him, but he still felt an overwhelming resistance. He wasn't ready to dive into the complex world of business decisions and financial stakes. Yet Linda's words had a weight to them, one he couldn't ignore. He knew she wasn't just concerned about Marcus. She was worried about her own future, about her ability to claim what she had been promised. Jason's father, even in his absence, had created a ticking time bomb that Jason was now expected to defuse. "I'll be there tomorrow," Jason replied, his voice hoarse. The next morning, Jason found himself sitting in a sleek conference room, surrounded by lawyers, financial advisors, and executives who had all been part of Marcus's life. They all knew Jason's father, but none of them knew him. It was a surreal experience, being surrounded by the very people who had made up the world he had tried to escape. The room was cold, clinical, with sharp angles and dim lighting. The air was thick with expectation. Everyone was waiting for him to take control, to speak, to give direction. Jason felt like a child, lost in a world of adults who had been playing the game for far too long. The moment was so overwhelming that he could barely find his voice. His fingers gripped the edges of the conference table as he glanced at the legal documents laid out in front of him. They were filled with clauses, stipulations, and signatures that were all foreign to him. Linda sat across from him, her eyes steely and calculating. She hadn't said much during the meeting, but Jason could feel the weight of her gaze, the pressure building with every passing second. Finally, the head lawyer turned to him. "Mr. Montgomery, if you're ready, we can move forward with the proceedings. Your father's assets, business holdings, and legacy are all in play. The decision of what happens next is in your hands." The word hung in the air like a sentence. Jason had never been prepared for this. He had lived his whole life avoiding this moment, and now that it was here, he was paralyzed with doubt. The room felt like it was closing in on him, every person there waiting for him to decide his future and his father's. Jason's hand shook as he picked up the pen in front of him. He could feel Linda's eyes on him, the subtle but undeniable pressure mounting. What would he do? Would he continue the legacy of ruthlessness his father had built, or would he walk away from it all and create his own path? The decision weighed on him like a 1,000-pound boulder, and as the eyes in the room watched him, Jason realized that this moment, this choice, would define the rest of his life. Without fully realizing it, he signed his name at the bottom of the document, sealing the future that had been carved by forces much bigger than himself. But it wasn't just a signature, it was a line in the sand. A declaration. Jason had made his choice, and now there was no turning back. The business, the empire, the legacy, everything had been handed to him. But as he looked around the room, his heart sank. This wasn't the victory he had imagined. He had signed his name on a future he had never wanted, a future that was filled with expectations he had never asked for. But somewhere, deep inside, Jason knew this was only the beginning. What came next would shape not just the Montgomery empire, but his very soul. The shocking revelations, the impossible choices, and the moral dilemmas were just starting. And as the room erupted into conversation around him, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that his life had already changed forever. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and constant pressure from every direction. Jason had signed the documents, sealing his fate in the Montgomery legacy, but he didn't feel like a leader. He felt like a pawn, a bystander in a game he hadn't chosen to play. The weight of it all bore down on him with each passing moment. He was expected to take the reins of his father's vast empire, but all Jason had known was a life of solitude, of working a regular job with no aspirations for anything more. Now, thrust into the world of multi-million-dollar deals and business maneuvers, he felt out of his depth, and yet there was no turning back. Linda, as much as Jason resented her presence, was there every step of the way, pushing him to make decisions, to act quickly before the company's stock fell or investors lost confidence. Every conversation with her was a reminder that she wasn't just his father's ex-wife. She was a sharp, calculating force with her own agenda. It wasn't long before Jason realized that Linda's intentions were far more complex than he had initially imagined. While she seemed to be offering him guidance, there was always an underlying tone of manipulation. She made it clear that she expected Jason to uphold the family's legacy, to continue the work Marcus had started, even if that meant making morally questionable decisions. But Jason was no fool. He knew that Linda had her own vision for the business, a vision that didn't necessarily include him. He wasn't sure if he could trust her, or anyone for that matter, in this high-stakes game. But one thing was becoming clearer by the day. If Jason was going to make it through this, he couldn't do it alone. As the weeks passed, Jason's sense of isolation grew. He spent hours locked away in the Montgomery boardroom, trying to make sense of the company's financials, struggling to understand the complex web of investments, acquisitions, and international dealings his father had orchestrated. The staff at the company, the lawyers, the advisors, they all spoke in terms he couldn't fully grasp. He was constantly behind, constantly playing catch-up. Every decision felt like it could destroy or save everything his father had built. And it wasn't just the company that Jason had to navigate. The world outside was watching, waiting for Marcus Montgomery's heir to step into the spotlight and prove himself. The media began to take notice of Jason's every move, portraying him as the reluctant billionaire, the son who had inherited a fortune but seemed clueless about how to manage it. It was an image he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. The pressure was suffocating, but worse than that was the nagging doubt in his mind. Was he doing the right thing? Was he just perpetuating the same cycle of greed, manipulation, and cold ambition that had marked his father's reign? One day, as Jason walked through the company's headquarters, his steps heavy with indecision, he was approached by an old employee, someone who had worked with Marcus for years. The man, Michael, had been one of the senior executives in the company's finance department. He was a tall, well-dressed man in his early 60s, his face lined with years of experience in the business world. "Mr. Montgomery," Michael said, his voice calm but serious. "I've been with this company since its early days, and I know what it takes to keep it running. But I also know that things can't keep going the way they have been. Your father made a lot of enemies, Jason. A lot of enemies." Jason's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice more tense than he intended. Michael took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I know you've just stepped into this, but I need you to understand something. Your father's success came at a price. He didn't just crush competitors. He ruined lives, broke families, destroyed people to get to the top. I'm not trying to scare you, but there are people out there who will do anything to see this company fall. They'll try to use you to get what they want. If you don't take control, if you don't make some tough choices, you'll be swallowed whole." The words hit Jason like a punch to the gut. He had known his father's business was cutthroat, but hearing it from someone who had been there, who had seen the full extent of the damage, made it feel real in a way that was impossible to ignore. Michael wasn't the first person to warn him. The more Jason learned about the inner workings of the company, the more he realized that Marcus had built his empire on a foundation of manipulation and ruthlessness. And now, that same empire was being thrust into his hands. What kind of man would he be? Would he follow in his father's footsteps, perpetuating the same legacy of power at all costs? Or would he try to change things, to make the company something that could benefit the employees and the community, instead of just enriching the few at the top? Jason was torn. He had never imagined that the decisions he made in those early days would have such a far-reaching impact. His every move was being scrutinized, analyzed, and picked apart by those who had everything to lose. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the biggest threat to the company wasn't the competition. It was the rot inside, the corruption that had infected every level of the organization. And if he didn't act soon, the company his father had built might crumble under its own weight. In the midst of all this, something unexpected happened. One of the company's junior employees, a young woman named Emily, came forward with an idea that Jason had never considered. Emily was bright, ambitious, and worked in the company's community outreach program. She was passionate about making a difference in the local community, about using the company's resources to give back. Her proposal was simple. Instead of focusing solely on profit, the company could shift its focus to creating sustainable, socially responsible projects. Emily's vision wasn't about making the business more profitable. It was about changing the company's culture from the inside out. At first, Jason dismissed the idea. It seemed naive, impossible even. The company was built on power, on control, and on taking what it wanted. But as he listened to Emily's passionate pitch, something stirred within him. He realized that perhaps this was the direction he needed to take. He didn't have to be his father. He didn't have to follow the same path of greed and destruction. He could rewrite the legacy. The decision wasn't easy, but Jason made it. He made the announcement to the board that the company would start investing in sustainable projects, in supporting local businesses, and in focusing on community welfare. It was a move that shocked everyone in the room, especially Linda, who had never been one to value social responsibility. But for Jason, it was the first step toward redemption, toward making the business something that could bring real change. The reaction was mixed. Some of the executives supported the idea, but others saw it as a betrayal of the company's core principles. Jason knew this wouldn't be easy, that the road ahead would be filled with resistance and challenges. But for the first time since stepping into his father's shoes, he felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just playing the game anymore, he was changing it. And that, in itself, was a victory. The impact of Jason's decision wasn't immediate, but over time, the company began to shift. It was subtle at first, but soon, employees began to feel a sense of pride in the work they were doing. Local businesses saw a boost in support, and the community began to notice the changes. Jason's vision was taking root, and with it, a new era for the Montgomery Empire. It wasn't the empire his father had built, but it was his own. And in that, Jason found something he had never expected: hope. The ripple effects of Jason's decision to shift the Montgomery Empire's focus were felt almost immediately, but not in the way he had hoped. While a few executives voiced their support for the new direction, most were skeptical, some even hostile. The old guard, those who had been with Marcus for years, were entrenched in the ways of the past, driven by profits, by competition, by a thirst for power. Jason's vision of sustainability, of community responsibility, was seen as naive, an idea that had no place in a world that demanded results, numbers, and dominance. The board meetings became tense, every decision questioned, every new initiative scrutinized. Linda, who had initially been quiet about the change, began to push back in subtle but firm ways. She questioned Jason's ability to lead, his lack of experience, and his failure to grasp the intricacies of the empire Marcus had built. "You're weakening the company," she would say, her voice smooth but sharp. "You're turning your back on everything your father worked for." Jason could feel the walls closing in on him. He had made his choice, but now, the consequences of that choice were far more difficult to navigate than he had ever anticipated. His days were filled with meetings that drained him, calls that demanded his attention, and an endless stream of questions from employees who wondered what this new direction would mean for their futures. Some feared layoffs, others feared the company would lose its competitive edge. For every small victory, for every project that took root in the community, there seemed to be 10 obstacles in his way. The media, too, had picked up on the shift, and the public's reaction was mixed. Some hailed Jason as a visionary, a man brave enough to challenge the status quo. But others dismissed him as the reluctant heir, someone who was simply trying to live up to his father's shadow without the courage to take on the real fight. It was in these moments of doubt, when Jason felt the weight of the empire pressing down on him, that he would retreat to the quiet of his father's study. The same study that had once been a place of power, of ruthlessness, now felt like a tomb, a place where Marcus's legacy hung heavy in the air. Jason had spent so many years wanting nothing to do with this life, and now, here he was, living it. And yet, every time he looked at the photos on the walls, the framed awards and accolades that had once meant everything to his father, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, judged, as if Marcus were still looming over him, waiting to see what his son would do. It was as though his father's specter never left, reminding him that his every move was tied to a legacy that demanded respect, control, and success. Yet Jason wasn't sure he wanted to honor that legacy in the way everyone expected him to. He didn't want to be a reflection of Marcus Montgomery. He wanted to be something different. But could he? Could he truly reshape an empire without destroying everything in the process? The pressure mounted. The community initiatives Jason had championed were struggling to gain traction. Investors began pulling back, citing concerns over the company's lack of clear direction. The stock market reacted negatively to the uncertainty, and before long, the company's value began to drop. With each passing day, Jason could feel the tension in the air, whispers of doubt, murmurs of failure. Linda, ever the pragmatist, began to make moves behind the scenes, speaking with key stakeholders and reminding them of Marcus's vision. Jason may be trying to change things, she would tell them. But the truth is, this company was built on hard decisions, on sacrifice. He's lost touch with that. Her words carried weight. And while Jason had the support of a few loyal employees, it wasn't enough. The empire his father had built was teetering on the edge of collapse, and Jason knew it was only a matter of time before his critics would strike. One morning, Jason walked into the boardroom, fully aware that something had shifted. There was an air of inevitability in the room, a collective sense that the company's future was hanging by a thread. The stock price had dipped even further, and the investors who had once believed in Marcus were now questioning the wisdom of his son's leadership. Linda was there, her face betraying no emotion, but Jason knew her too well. She was playing her cards, waiting for the right moment to step in and seize control. "Jason," one of the senior executives said, breaking the silence, "we need to talk about the future of this company. We're losing market share, and your focus on community projects is admirable, but it's not enough. The investors want results. We need to return to the core of what made us successful. Power. Control." The words stung. Jason's vision, his dream of creating a company that valued people over profit, was being torn apart. And it wasn't just the boardroom that was against him. His own doubts were starting to creep in. Was he fighting for something that could never be? Was his idealism misplaced in a world that thrived on greed and competition? As the meeting continued, Jason's mind raced. He could feel the tide turning, and he knew that if he didn't act soon, he would lose everything. Linda's influence was growing, and if he didn't fight back, she would take over. He had to make a choice. His father's legacy was not just a set of values. It was a machine, a well-oiled machine that required a steady hand and unwavering resolve to keep it running. Was he capable of doing that? Was he capable of stepping into the role his father had played, of putting the company's survival above all else, including his own ideals? Jason's heart was heavy as he left the boardroom. He had always hoped there was another way, a path that didn't require him to become someone he didn't want to be. But the longer he fought against the tide, the more he realized that sometimes survival required sacrifice. He wasn't sure if he could live with that sacrifice, but he didn't know if he had a choice. He had inherited a legacy that demanded much more than he was willing to give. And as he walked through the halls of the Montgomery Empire, the weight of his decisions pressed down on him harder than ever before. The choices he made in the coming days would not only determine his own future, but the future of the empire that had defined him. For better or for worse, could he stay true to himself and find a way to salvage what was left of his father's empire, or would he be forced to abandon his vision for a brighter future and return to the cold, heartless world that had built it? Only time would tell. The days that followed were a whirlwind of decisions, emotions, and realizations that would forever shape Jason's future. The tension in the boardroom was palpable, and it was clear that time was running out. Investors, feeling the weight of declining stock prices, were growing impatient. The pressure to revert to the old ways, the ways that had once made Marcus Montgomery's name synonymous with power and wealth, was almost too much to ignore. Jason could feel himself on the edge, teetering between his vision of a more responsible, community-focused company and the harsh realities of an empire that thrived on competition, domination, and profit at all costs. But in the quiet moments, when he was alone in the study that had once belonged to his father, Jason realized that he couldn't give up on what he believed in. He thought about the people who had supported his ideas, about the young employees who looked up to him, who believed that change was possible. He thought about Emily, the young woman who had first inspired him with her vision for a more sustainable company, and about the local businesses and communities that had started to benefit from the initiatives he had championed. They were small victories, yes, but they were victories nonetheless. Jason could feel them in his bones, in his heart. They were the foundation he had been building, and he wasn't about to let it crumble just because it was easier to go back to the way things were. So he made a choice. It wasn't the easy one, and it wasn't the one that would guarantee success, but it was the one that felt right. Jason decided to confront the board head-on. He called an emergency meeting, one that he knew would be make or break. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about the legacy he wanted to leave, about the kind of man he wanted to be. It was about standing up for what was right, even if it meant facing the very people who had once respected his father's iron-fisted rule. When the meeting began, Jason stood at the head of the table, the faces of the board members staring back at him, some with skepticism, others with quiet disdain. Linda, as always, sat at the opposite end of the table, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp, calculating. Jason took a deep breath before speaking. "I know that many of you think the path I've chosen is a mistake," he began, his voice steady but resolute. "I know that my father's empire was built on a different set of principles, on a vision of control, of power, of winning at all costs. But what I've come to realize is that those principles have cost us more than they've gained us. They've cost us trust. They've cost us our humanity. And they've certainly cost us the future." The room was silent as he continued. "I know that many of you want me to turn things around the way my father would have. I know you want me to fight for profits, to make deals that benefit us without regard for anyone else. But that's not who I want to be. I've seen too much damage in the world to pretend that this company, as it was, can thrive without breaking others along the way." Linda's expression hardened, but Jason ignored her. He had to. He had to speak the truth, even if it meant facing her wrath. "I've decided to take this company in a new direction. I won't abandon our legacy, but I will transform it. We will focus on people. We will focus on sustainability. We will focus on our community. We will be a business that not only survives but thrives while giving back to those who need it the most." Jason let the words hang in the air for a moment, letting their weight settle over the room. He saw some faces soften, others tighten in resistance, but he wasn't looking for consensus. He wasn't looking for applause. He was simply looking for truth. "I understand that some of you may not agree with this vision," he said, his voice unwavering. "But I believe it is the only way forward. If you're not on board with that, if you're not willing to take this leap with me, then I understand. But this is the direction I'm going in." The silence that followed was thick with tension, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Jason's heart was racing, but he stood his ground. He had made his choice. He was ready for whatever came next. Finally, one of the board members spoke. "Jason, you're asking us to gamble on an uncertain future," he said, his voice cautious but tinged with respect. "But I can see it in your eyes. You believe this is the right path. And maybe you're right. We've been stuck in the past for too long." Another board member nodded, though there was still hesitation in his eyes. "This is risky, Jason, but we'll support you. For now." Jason nodded, feeling a rush of gratitude mixed with disbelief. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a small one. Slowly, the rest of the room began to murmur in agreement. They weren't all on board, but a shift had occurred. The seed of change had been planted, and it was starting to take root. Linda, however, remained silent, her gaze never leaving Jason's. She said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. Jason knew she wasn't going to go down without a fight. The legacy she had spent years cultivating, her role in the empire, was slipping from her grasp, and she wouldn't let it go without a struggle. That evening, as the board meeting concluded, Jason stepped outside the building and into the cool night air. He could feel the weight of the decision he had just made, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. He had stood up for his beliefs, for the vision he had for the company and for the world. And though the future was uncertain, it was his to shape. The next few weeks were filled with more resistance. Investors pulled out, business partners hesitated, and Linda began to rally behind-the-scenes efforts to undermine Jason's leadership. But Jason didn't back down. He continued pushing forward with his plans, turning the company's focus to sustainable investments and community-based initiatives. It was slow, painful work, but slowly things began to shift. The company's culture began to change. Employees started to feel like they were part of something greater, something meaningful. Local communities began to see the benefits of the company's newfound focus on social responsibility. And in the midst of it all, Jason realized something. He wasn't just saving the company, he was saving himself. Every decision he made, every step he took, was pulling him closer to the person he wanted to become. He was no longer the son of Marcus Montgomery, the heir to a fortune built on control and domination. He was Jason Montgomery, a man who had chosen a different path, one built on integrity, compassion, and a vision for a better world. As the months passed, the company began to see gradual growth again, but it was a different kind of success. It wasn't just measured in dollars and cents, it was measured in lives changed, in communities uplifted, in employees who felt valued. And while Jason knew the road ahead would be difficult, he had faith that this was the right path, one that would ultimately leave a legacy far more meaningful than anything his father had built. One day, as he walked through the company's headquarters, he was stopped by Emily, the young woman who had first inspired him. She smiled at him, her eyes bright with optimism. "You did it," she said softly. "You really did it." Jason smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile of quiet satisfaction. "We did it," he corrected her. And in that moment, as he looked out over the bustling offices, he realized that the real victory wasn't in the empire he had inherited. It was in the empire he was building. One decision, one person, one community at a time.